ከሬዲዮ አብራር የሚሰራጭላችሁ የዘውትር ዝግጅታችን ነው። ዛሬ ዕለቱ ሐሙስ ጁን 13 2013 ነው። መልካም ቆይታ። The radio abroad presentation today will be the art of war በሚል የተዘጋጀ ዝግጅታችን ነው እና መልካም ቆይታ ዝግጅታችንን ለምትከታተሉት ማለት ነው እና ዝግጅታችን አሁን ይጀምራል።
These women have spent their entire lives in luxury. Trained from birth in the art of pleasure, they know nothing of the world beyond the king's royal court. But two of these women are about to die a gruesome death. The name of their executioner is one you might have heard. Sun Tzu, warrior, philosopher, and creator of the art of war. This ancient text holds the keys to victory in war and life. Now, the art of war's tactics and strategies are revealed in graphic detail to help solve a military mystery. Were the outcomes of America's greatest battles foretold some 2,000 years ago? Did the art of war prophesize the Nazis' ultimate doom? Predict how the North would win the Civil War? And predict why America would be defeated in Vietnam. Understand the art of war's lessons, and you will prevail. Ignore them, and you fight in darkness. State of Wu agonizes over a growing threat. A hostile neighbor is poised to invade. Desperate to defend his kingdom, Helu summons one of the greatest military minds in history, Sun Tzu.
Sun Tzu is important because he has a cohesive, holistic philosophy of how to approach strategy. If you listen to Sun Tzu, if you follow his principles, you will be victorious. If you ignore him, you do so at your own peril, because you will definitely lose.
Sun Tzu assures King Helu that he can train the smaller Wu army to overcome and defeat the larger invading force.
King Helu asks Sun Tzu, challenges Sun Tzu in something of a mocking way. He says, you claim that you can turn anyone into a soldier. Can you turn these palace women, these spoiled, soft concubines, into a fighting force? Sun Tzu answers, of course I can. He simply shows the women what the important maneuvers are. He chooses the two most senior of these concubines to serve as platoon leaders, and charges them with making sure discipline is observed in their units.
But when Sun Tzu orders the exercise to begin, the women simply laugh.
Sun Tzu say, well, okay, maybe my instructions were not clear to you. Let me rephrase again my instructions to you. In simple language, he told the concubines, when the drums is sounded, you as concubines must assemble as soldiers with your spears, with your swords, and fall in line. Second time, what happens? They still giggle away.
But Sun Tzu says, if the orders are unclear, it is the fault of the general that the troops do not obey. But if the orders are clear, and my orders have been clear, it's the fault of the subordinate officers that the orders are not obeyed.
There is only one way Sun Tzu can convince the concubines that he is deadly serious. understood, everyone from the leader down to the individual soldier will be motivated to win. Sun Tzu appoints 2 new officers. The women now follow his orders without hesitation.
And the big takeaway from this incident for King Helu is that even a state like Wu, which is relatively weak in terms of numbers compared to its larger neighbor Chu, can nonetheless wield a disciplined, effective military force if they take Sun Tzu's teachings to heart and implement them throughout their military.
While these women will never see battle, Sun Tzu has proved his point. King Helu appoints Sun Tzu as commander of the Wu army. Sun Tzu must now make good on his promise to train a force of 30,000 to fight an army 10 times larger. The strategies and tactics he uses in this showdown become the foundation of his masterwork, The Art of War. Sun Tzu writes The Art of War around 500 BC. The book is written on vertical bamboo strips, each the length of a chopstick. Each strip contains 15 to 25 Chinese characters. The strips are then painstakingly stitched together. Inside the 13 chapters of The Art of War lie the secrets to success.
Basically, if you understand the art of war and the principles in it, you can predict how wars or battles will turn out.
The Art of War is filled with many important insights, but there are 3 key principles that stand out and unify Sun Tzu's philosophy. Sun Tzu says, know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril. In the art of war, understanding your opponent is crucial to victory. Sun Tzu says, to win 100 battles is not the height of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is. Fighting costs lives and money. Sun Tzu prizes the general who can outwit instead of outfight his opponent. Sun Tzu says, avoid what is strong, attack what is weak. Throughout history, armies fight head-to-head on the battlefield to show their strength and courage, but Sun Tzu doesn't care about glory. He only wants to win.
While each of these principles is important, think of them as cords in a strong rope. Individually, they may be strong, but when you put them together and use them holistically, they're unbreakable.
For more than 1,000 years, Sun Tzu's secrets are kept hidden, made available only to emperors and authorized scholars. They surface in the 8th century in Japan, and since then, their insights have spread throughout the world. More recently, The Art of War has spawned hundreds of books that apply its teachings to sports, politics, and business. Today, it's part of the core curriculum at many war colleges, including West Point. But as we shall see, Sun Tzu's advice isn't always heeded, which often leads to disaster.
I think throughout time, if generals had listened to Sun Tzu, you would probably not have seen a lot of the bloody wars of attrition that mankind has suffered through. He was very focused on how do I achieve my goal with the minimum amount of resources used, with the minimum amount of destruction.
Sun Tzu's principles are about to be put to the test. Sun Tzu has trained the army of Wu to defend itself against the powerful state of Chu to the west.
The outset of this war between Wu and Chu, when Sun Tzu is given command of an army of Wu, it seems that Chu holds all the advantages. Sun Tzu's army is only about 33,000 men, where Chu can field forces of hundreds of thousands of men.
Leading 300,000 Chu warriors is a power-hungry and corrupt prime minister named Nam Hua. Nam Hua cuts a swath of destruction through the Chinese countryside. Outnumbered nearly 10 to 1, Sun Tzu could prepare his defenses and wait for the Chu onslaught. But being Sun Tzu, he does the unexpected. He invades Chu. Sun Tzu doesn't attack Nanghua's army head-on. He chooses soft targets, like remote outposts and border crossings.
It would be unwise for Sun Tzu to try to seek a decisive engagement early in this war by attacking the Chu army directly. He simply does not have the mass necessary to do that.
Sun Tzu attacks with blistering speed and brutal efficiency. Nanghua immediately launches counteroffensives, but when the reinforcements arrive, Sun Tzu's soldiers are gone and attacking the next location.
By keeping Chu constantly shifting its forces back and forth on the frontier, he frustrates their leaders and gains at the same time a much better picture of the way the Chu armies will likely fight.
After every battle and skirmish, Sun Tzu gains a better understanding of his enemies.
He downplays the value of direct attack and puts the emphasis on maneuver, surprise, deception.
All warfare should be based upon the intellect. In fact, the greatest battles of all time have been won by the brain and not by brute force.
That doesn't stop Nanghua from trying. He eventually launches 100,000 soldiers to try to crush the guerrilla attacks.
And this reminds me of the difference between chess and the Chinese game of Go. Chess is very much attrition-based. You start the board with many, many pieces. Over the game, they're eliminated, and at the end, you've only got a few pieces left standing.
The object of chess is to force your opponent to surrender by eliminating his pieces. Each piece has its own rank and can only move in a specific way. The goal of chess is to kill the king.
In contrast to that, the Chinese game of Go starts with the board empty, and you use as few pieces as possible to acquire as much territory as you can. And in that sense, it's a very resource-efficient strategy.
The object of Go is not the destruction of the opponent's force, but the conquest of space. The goal of Go is to capture the most territory with the least number of stones. Using a Go-like strategy, Sun Tzu decides where and when he fights. He avoids the strongest part of Nanghua's army and attacks where it is weakest. Sun Tzu's guerrilla tactics against the Chu forces echo throughout history. But it's during an infamous war more than 2,000 years later that they resonate most loudly, and where Sun Tzu's ultimate secret becomes most evident. It's the mid-1960s, and the world's greatest superpower battles North Vietnamese communists in a country smaller than the state of Montana. General William Westmoreland, a hard-nosed World War II combat officer, sees the battlefield like a chessboard, where armies stand and fight head-on. But unlike chess, Vietnam has no clear objective for Westmoreland to attack.
It's a classic case of a general fighting the last war, and in the sense that the lessons he had learned there only applied partially to Vietnam. There were no fixed objectives to be taken. There were no fixed units to be destroyed.
No one understands this better than North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap, who sees Vietnam, like Sun Tzu would, as a go-board. Instead of facing the overwhelming U.S. military directly, he uses insurgent forces, the Viet Cong, to stage hit-and-run attacks all over the country.
We see something very similar to Sun Tzu's raids into Chu in North Vietnamese tactics and operations in the Vietnam War.
Giap has learned Sun Tzu's principle that it is more important to outthink your enemy than to outfight him. And it's tactics and strategy, not overwhelming firepower, that causes the U.S. to ultimately lose the war in Vietnam, a loss that Sun Tzu predicted thousands of years earlier. How Sun Tzu was able to do this, as well as predict the outcome of the invasion of Normandy and the final harrowing day of battle at Gettysburg, is about to be revealed. Sun Tzu says, in war, numbers alone confer no advantage. Do not advance relying on sheer military power. It's the mid-1960s in Vietnam. U.S. General William Westmoreland orders intense aerial bombardments. The U.S. will eventually drop nearly 7 million tons of bombs on Indochina during the war, more than twice the tonnage of all the bombs dropped by the U.S. in World War II. But the Americans are about to learn Sun Tzu's lesson the hard way. That despite overwhelming military power and the valor of its soldiers, the U.S. cannot win this war.
Between 1959 and 1975, the North Vietnamese fought a very desperate war against the South Vietnamese government and their U.S. allies. And even though they were heavily outgunned, when you look at how the war was fought and see that through Sun Tzu's eyes, it's obvious how they prevailed.
Westmoreland uses a chess-inspired strategy. Stop the communist spread by killing as many North Vietnamese and Viet Cong as possible. Conversely, Westmoreland's adversary, the North Vietnamese general Vo Nguyen Giap, uses more of a Sun Tzu Go strategy.
Westmoreland is trying to attrit the enemy, trying to kill as many as possible. Giap, meanwhile, is looking at it from more of a go perspective, trying to focus on how do I win as much territory as possible and thus defeat my enemy.
To combat the American aerial bombardment, Giap looks to a key Sun Tzu principle. Know your enemy and know yourself, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril.
The way the Americans often operated was somewhat predictable. They would prepare a landing zone through artillery strikes and airstrikes, and then they would bring the troops in. Giap recognized this and realized that if he could have his troops hunker down and survive the artillery attacks, then when the troops landed, they would be able to set up ambushes to take them on.
The American bombs don't destroy the enemy. They merely telegraph that the U.S. infantry is on its way. Giap also orders his fighters to stay as close to American soldiers as possible.
Viet Cong have no tactical air. They also understand that once their positions get identified in any given battle, they're going to get whacked from the air. So how do you compensate for that? Well, General Giap said you grab the enemy by the belt. Put another way, what you want to do is you don't want to establish positions out there. And when they did defensively, for example, like at Hamburger Hill, wham, they get hit by lots of air. But if you're in a tactical situation, you close with the enemy. You intermingle your forces with his, so they can't bring air power to bear without hurting their own troops.
Free from U.S. bombs, Giap launches Sun Tzu-inspired guerrilla attacks against Americans on the ground. Ambushes, hand grenade booby traps, and snipers.
What Giap starts to do is close-in harassing raids against the Americans. And Sun Tzu likes this idea because by forcing the enemy to maneuver, to respond to you, he reveals strengths and weaknesses. And the more you know about his strengths and weaknesses, the more you can avoid the strengths and attack and exploit the weaknesses.
The major U.S. weakness in this war is not on the battlefield.
Now, our weakness was not in Vietnam. We never lost anything in Vietnam. We lost no engagements in Vietnam. But we did lose in the resolution of the American people to pursue the war. Jap realized this from the very start, and he did not try to defeat us in Vietnam. He tried to defeat us in the United States.
Giap knows that if he can turn the American people against the war, he can defeat the overpowering U.S. military. In the beginning of the war, nearly 80% of Americans supported the military action in Vietnam. Between 1965 and 1967, President Johnson increases troop strength dramatically from 190,000 to almost 500,000. But more soldiers means more casualties.
Between 1959 and 1965, the U.S. had suffered 2,000 battle deaths. But then in 1966, it jumped to 6,000, and then in 1967, it jumped to 11,000. And this was because Westmoreland was enacting an attrition-based strategy. He wanted to take the battle to the North Vietnamese and try to kill as many of their soldiers as possible. And of course, this led to higher casualties among the Americans.
Ignoring the rising death toll and the potential political backlash, Westmoreland persists with his chess-like strategy.
One does not win wars by winning battles. That's a very archaic concept. The Romans learned this. They fought for 40 years in Spain. They fought for 30 years in England and still couldn't subdue the insurgencies. Battles and military operations are nothing more than means to an end. Means to the achievement of strategic goals, okay? Those goals, by the way, are often political. What often happens to military men is they, as we used to say in the Army, you dance with who brung you. They're military guys. They got one trick. Their trick is war, okay? And what happens, and happens to us now, is that essentially the war and the battles become an end in itself without any consideration of whether or not it leads to the ultimate strategic goal of breaking the will of the enemy.
But no matter how bloody the battlefield gets, the Vietnamese will is never broken. Giap famously claims he's willing to lose 10 men for every one American. Many North Vietnamese troops wear a tattoo that says, "Born in the North, to die in the South." And it's this difference that Giap knows will allow him to defeat the Americans, who now have more than 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam, many of whom don't want to be there.
Believe me, all conscripts want to do is get the hell out of the country. You know, everybody arrives with what we call their DEROS date, date of expected return overseas. You know, scratch somewhere, across your forehead, this is when I get to go home. And it's very hard to train them to do the kinds of stuff that Special Operations Forces have to do in order to fight an insurgency. So you put it all together, and it's a failure of strategic thinking, a failure to appreciate the cultural context in which things occurred, and inevitably deduce from that a failure to develop tactics that are effective.
To combat Giap's guerrilla insurgency, Westmoreland launches search and destroy missions throughout South Vietnam. He believes he is successfully rooting out Giap's Viet Cong insurgents. But a Pentagon report released after the war shows just how wrong he actually was.
What it found was that in more than 80% of the cases where American troops fought Viet Cong troops, that in fact it was the enemy that chose the time and place of the ambush. That in point of fact, we were not searching and destroying anything. In point of fact, if the enemy didn't want to fight, they just let us stumble on through the bush. But when they wanted to fight, they would pick the time and place.
Giap's guerrilla tactics are working, but his Sun Tzu-inspired strategy is suddenly overruled by his commanding officers. He is ordered to plan a full-scale direct offensive against the U.S. forces. Giap knows this is suicide, so instead he modifies the plan. Returning to Sun Tzu's principles, he decides to coordinate a simultaneous multi-pronged attack in hundreds of different locations across South Vietnam. The date for the attack? January 31st, 1968. Vietnam's Lunar New Year holiday called Tet. Giap has less than 9 months to plan his Tet Offensive, a Sun Tzu-inspired strategy that will prove to be a powerful turning point in the war. Sun Tzu says, "Let your plans be as dark as night, then strike like a thunderbolt." During the Vietnam War, North Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap prepares his Tet Offensive in absolute secrecy. And just like the master Sun Tzu, Giap puts his faith in his spies.
Sun Tzu places a great importance on spies, and in fact, he devotes an entire chapter to the different types of spies and how they can be used.
Sun Tzu would have been impressed with General Giap's spy network in South Vietnam.
Giap understood that accurate knowledge of the enemy is worth 10 divisions. And so what happened was he literally had created a spy network that was unrivaled. I mean, every barman, every taxi driver, every taxi dancer, anyone who dealt with Americans was potentially a source of information for the Viet Cong.
The man who ran the taxi stand outside U.S. headquarters in Saigon is supposedly the chief of Viet Cong intelligence.
The point was by simply overhearing what Americans were saying, what soldiers were telling girls, the prostitutes, the drug dealers, all of this thing. By collecting that information together, able essentially to predict the movement of American units. And as a result, as the study later shows, we didn't surprise anybody. They knew we were coming almost all the time.
With up-to-the-minute information on his enemy, Giap moves forward with his plans for the Tet Offensive. The element of surprise is key, but means nothing if his men aren't sufficiently armed. Giap's next challenge is to figure out how to smuggle in and hide thousands of weapons throughout South Vietnam. The solution is all Sun Tzu: deception and secrecy. Giap goes underground.
What we found is an enormous complex of tunnels that ran for miles and 3 and 4 levels deep. There were field hospitals below there, supply depots. It's where the VC and NVA would go to rest and recuperation. There was booze, gals down there, and some of them ran underneath American base camps.
The largest of these tunnel complexes is north of Saigon in Cu Chi. Stretching from the Cambodian border, it has more than 75 miles of interconnecting passages. Built by the Vietnamese in the 1940s and 50s, the tunnels were originally dug out of the hard clay by hand with simple farm tools. Over the next decade, the tunnels are expanded and fortified with zigzags and sharp drops to resist U.S. attack. The Viet Cong had secret entrances, camouflaged ventilation systems, and booby-trapped doors.
How in all heck's name do you fight in tunnels? You use what we call tunnel rats, which were often urban Irish kids, little, not I say little, but 5'5", 5'6", thin, but brave as hell. I mean, to go down through those holes into the tunnels armed only with a .45, sometime in a flashlight. I mean, that's really war up close and personal, never knowing what you were going to find on it.
Giap funnels tens of thousands of Viet Cong troops through these tunnels as the Tet Offensive draws nearer. With just 2 months until Tet, Giap plays what might be his greatest deception. Vietnam announces it will honor the traditional Tet ceasefire.
Part of the deception campaign is actually agreeing to a ceasefire over Tet. This really lulls the Americans and the South Vietnamese into thinking that they can relax their guard, send troops home, and there will be no conflict during those holidays.
Now, with Tet a little more than a week away, Giap launches a surprise attack on the remote U.S. base at Khe Sanh. U.S. Marines fight back waves of North Vietnamese soldiers that try to overrun the sprawling compound. The U.S. is determined not to lose Khe Sanh.
Lyndon Johnson Wisconsin. He actually has a scale model of the battlefield built that he can monitor it on a daily basis. He even goes and takes the step that he makes the Joint Chiefs of Staff sign a paper that says the Americans will not lose Quezon.
But Quezon is not Giap's real objective. It's a ploy to draw U.S. attention away from the cities before Tet. Sun Tzu would applaud Giap's maneuver. Sun Tzu says, in battle, use a direct attack to engage and an indirect attack to win. In the art of war, you should always try to deceive your enemy. Pick a place you want to attack, then attack somewhere else to divert his attention. While he's distracted, capture your real objective. Giap has done everything he can to prepare for the Tet offensive. He uses spies, secrecy, and deception. The time to attack is now at hand. January 31st, 1968. Fireworks crackle. It's the Tet Lunar New Year. Suddenly, the celebration turns deadly. More than 80,000 Viet Cong troops carry out simultaneous individual attacks on more than 100 cities, villages, and U.S. bases all across South Vietnam. The Tet Offensive has begun.
The Americans and the South Vietnamese are shocked. They were stunned. They had thought the enemy was on his last legs, yet reports are coming in from everywhere, every city, every town, every base, that they're under attack.
U.S. commanders see the map of South Vietnam light up like a pinball machine.
We couldn't believe that they had moved this many troops this close to the cities, and they very patient, had taken months to position arms there and troops and give them cover. An amazing logistical feat.
Giap's informants lead the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese troops through the streets to strategic targets. One group captures the national radio station, while another blows a hole in the wall of the American embassy and fights its way onto the grounds. The Tet offensive looks like it might succeed, but the North has ignored one very important Sun Tzu principle, and it will cost them. Sun Tzu says there are 5 fundamental factors for success in war: weather, terrain, leadership, military doctrine, and most importantly, moral influence. Moral influence means a leader must have the will of the people behind him. Otherwise, a war will ultimately fail. It's an important clue in solving the mystery of whether Sun Tzu predicted America's demise in Vietnam. As the Tet Offensive rages in 1968, the Viet Cong carry blacklists and assassinate South Vietnamese sympathizers at will. One of the most brutal massacres takes place in the city of Hue.
They massacred 5,000 people in Hue, many of them government functionaries whose only crime was that they worked in a government agency. And also they exterminated, they literally shot several hundred nuns whose only crime was that they were Catholic nuns. That brutality, I think, backfired. A lot of Vietnamese said, wait a minute, this is not the kind of thing we do. It's not the kind of people we want to live under. But it was a terrible and, in my judgment, pointless massacre.
Without the will of the people, Giap's small units are left without reinforcements. They have no idea what to do, and no way to communicate with each other. Then, U.S. forces sweep in and devastate the fragmented North Vietnamese fighters. 10,000 die in the first few days of the attack, while U.S. forces suffer only 250 casualties. Tet is a military disaster for the North Vietnamese. But Sun Tzu's concept of moral influence cuts both ways. When Americans see the images of the Tet Offensive on their television screens, popular support for the war rapidly erodes.
This had the effect of just simply turning everybody's feelings about the war upside down. We had thought we were winning in Vietnam, and we were finding that we were losing in Vietnam. And at that moment, I think everything changed in America.
Despite losing the battle, Giap is well on his way to winning the war by defeating the U.S. where it matters most. At home. After Tet, Giap returns to his guerrilla tactics. In 1975, with U.S. military support all but gone, Saigon finally falls to the North Vietnamese army. At the end of the war, U.S. Colonel Harry Summers meets with North Vietnamese leaders to negotiate the American withdrawal.
Harry Summers had a meeting with Colonel Tu's North Vietnamese counterpart in Hanoi, probably getting a little angry at what was going on, and snapped at the colonel, the Vietnamese colonel, "Well, the truth is you never beat us on the battlefield." The Vietnamese colonel looked at him and said, "Well, that's true," he said, "but it's also irrelevant." And there you have it. It was the political context that was important far more than the military, as it always is throughout history. One more time to remember that war is a means to an end, and that end is almost always governed by politics, not by military victory or defeat.
This is a notion that General Giap well understood, as did the master, Sun Tzu. It's about 500 BC in ancient China. Sun Tzu's hit-and-run campaign against the kingdom of Chu is working. Sun Tzu's adversary, the Chu Prime Minister Nang Hua, grows frustrated and loses some political allies.
Nang Hua and his generals are increasingly frustrated by Sun Tzu's cross-border raids. The constant harassment is undermining the morale of the Chu troops. Money is being drained out of the Chu treasury. In some cases, the best of Chu's warriors are either killed or captured by Sun Tzu. Faced with this dilemma, Nang Hua is forced to turn to Chu's allies for men, money, and materiel.
Throughout the countryside, there is fear of where Sun Tzu will strike next. Leaders in the royal court begin to lose faith in Nang Hua, and allies begin to defect to Sun Tzu's side. But this disloyalty doesn't come without punishment. Nang Hua deploys his army to destroy a rogue ally in the north called Sai. As the capital is about to be attacked, the Duke of Sai calls on Sun Tzu for help. Sun Tzu now faces a seemingly no-win situation. If he does nothing, his ally will be destroyed. If he tries to save his ally, Nang Hua will crush his army. But for Sun Tzu, the solution is simple. He leads a small force towards Sai to act as bait to draw Nang Hua away from the city. It's a key principle of Sun Tzu's teaching. To move your enemy, entice him with something he is certain to take.
This is this whole idea of, in a sense, achieving kind of a maneuver dominance or controlling enemy movement by your own maneuver.
Nang Hua immediately stops his siege on Sai and mobilizes his army to intercept Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu saves his ally without drawing a sword. But will he be able to save himself?
While Sun Tzu has succeeded in drawing Nang Hua away from his siege of Sai, it seems that he's maneuvered himself into a trap. He's surrounded by Nang Hua's forces.
Sun Tzu has placed his men where there is no possibility of retreat. He has placed them on death ground. Sun Tzu says, put the army in the face of death, where there is no escape, and they will not flee or be afraid. there is nothing they cannot achieve. Sun Tzu studied every aspect of war, including the psychology of men facing imminent death.
Sun Tzu says that when the men know that they are in death ground, they will be transformed. They'll become overnight fearless fighters, that they will fight with all they have in order to win.
On death ground is exactly where Sun Tzu wants his soldiers. And it is on death ground that another great army finds itself, with the fate of the world hanging in the balance. June 6, 1944. Allied troops in World War II invade Europe. They land on the treacherous beaches of Normandy, France.
If you put troops on a beach from which there is no retreat, and there's almost no retreat from beaches, then they will fight because they have to fight to survive. And you can see this at Normandy.
What those men went through was almost unbelievable. When you see those beaches and you see what those men had to face, it's absolutely sobering to realize. And it makes you very proud to be an American, as far as I'm concerned.
How they survive and ultimately defeat the Nazis is predicted in the pages of Sun Tzu's Art of War. Sun Tzu says, all warfare is deception. If you can deceive your enemy before battle, you are more likely to win.
Imagine I got 10,000 soldiers, you got 1 million. Right, so what I have to do to counter you? Right, I have to deceive you, right, into splitting out your forces into more diverse groups.
Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower takes this principle to heart as he prepares to invade Europe during World War II. His invasion strategy at Normandy is one of the most daring in history, and it's foreshadowed in the pages of Sun Tzu's Art of War. By 1944, Nazi Germany knows the Allies are coming, but they don't know where or when.
It's very clear at some point that in order to win World War II, the Allies would have had to invade the continent. And the build-up in England is the only place they could build up from. Meant it was going to come somewhere on the coast of France. The only question is where.
There are only 3 feasible locations where the Allies could land: the Pas-de-Calais, the Cherbourg Peninsula, or the Normandy beaches.
The reason why this was true is that the Allies were absolutely certain to only land on a beach that could be protected by the air power of the fighter planes that could fly out of southern England. The range of these fighters was 400 miles. Therefore, any landing site had to be within 200 miles of these beaches.
But even with their support, the Allies know a beach invasion of Europe is nearly impossible. To succeed, they must employ more of a go strategy than a chess strategy. So instead of a direct attack, the Allies follow Sun Tzu's principle of deception and convince the Germans the attack will not occur at Normandy.
One way Normandy is comparable to Go is the fact that the deception is involved. As you're playing Go, you are signaling by your moves which parts of the territory you're going to try and conquer.
What the Allies were able to do with the clever use of deception, as well as actually clear military logic, was to convince the Germans that when it came, it would come at Pas-de-Calais. And when in fact, they planned to come at Normandy.
It's called Operation Fortitude, and it's one of the most complex deception campaigns ever attempted. The Allies create a fake army that appears ready to strike at Calais. They use inflatable tanks, planes, and trucks to fool German photo reconnaissance.
They would move the tanks and the trucks around at night, and they would have men with rollers
actually making the tracks so that there would actually be tracks in the ground so that it would look like there was a real movement of troops during the night.
The Phantom Army needs to be seen and heard, so Allied Army personnel broadcast endless hours of fake transmissions about troop and supply movements.
On the one hand, you would think it'd be a bit of a funny job because you're just sending bogus traffic. But on the other hand, it's a very important job that if they were lax in it or they didn't do it well, it would defeat the whole purpose of the deception plan.
Eisenhower shows the Germans his fake army, but keeps his real fighting force an absolute secret. For weeks, they are successful in their deception campaign. But 1 month before the D-Day invasion of Normandy is set to begin, the Allies fear their secret is out. British counterintelligence officers discover 5 crucial Normandy code names in a single newspaper crossword puzzle: Overlord, Neptune, Utah, Omaha, and Mulberry. British agents track down the creator of the crossword puzzle, a 54-year-old teacher named Leonard Daw.
And they interrogate him, and he gets very indignant and says, am I not allowed to choose the words that I want for a crossword puzzle? And they press him, but at the end of the day, they figure out that he is actually telling the truth and that the words were actually just an accident.
With the scare behind them, the Allies must now actively sell the Germans on the Calais invasion threat. They turn to one of Sun Tzu's favorite methods: spies. Sun Tzu says it is essential to seek out enemy agents who have come to spy against you and bribe them to serve you.
In the art of war, double agents are the most important spies. Double agents begin as the spies that your adversary has sent to spy on you. When you find them out, you don't jail them or execute them. You hire them. You give them lavish rewards. And what they start to do then is they continue to act as if they're spying on you, but the information they feed back to your adversary is misinformation.
During World War II, nobody uses double agents better than the British. Their program is called Double Cross, and one of their key double agents is a Welsh naval contractor named Alfred Owen.
When the war breaks out, he's picked up right away. And they offer him a deal. Either come over and become a double agent for us, or essentially you go to prison, and many of them were executed. And he gets the code word snow. And so when the Germans try to infiltrate their first wave of spies in September of 1940, the Germans radio Snow and let him know that these 4 agents are coming in. And of course, they're met with a British reception committee right away.
Double Cross is so successful that British intelligence is able to turn or imprison nearly every spy sent by Germany during the war. These double agents, Marble, Brutus, and Tricycle, give such convincing misinformation that the Germans not only believe the invasion is coming to Calais, but it's the Normandy landing that's the diversion. Sun Tzu says, the way a wise general can achieve greatness beyond ordinary men is through foreknowledge. Sun Tzu teaches the importance of deception and foreknowledge to uncover the enemy's intentions. The Allies gain foreknowledge by breaking German codes. For years, the Germans believe their encoding machine, called Enigma, is completely unbreakable. It can scramble a message 150 million ways. But with the help of a Polish mathematician, British intelligence does the impossible. They are able to decode an intercepted German message within hours. They call their code-breaking system Ultra.
Through Ultra, the Allies know what the Germans are thinking, what their perceptions are of the battlefield, and their view of what's happening. Thus, they're able to feed German spies information that reinforces those misconceptions.
Sun Tzu would prize Ultra for its ability to read the mind of the enemy.
The art of war essentially is using the mind to fight the war. Meaning to say that it is a mind-to-mind battle. So in order to win, against the enemy, you must be able to read the mind of the enemy.
But sometimes, knowing what your enemy is thinking creates moral dilemmas. According to a British intelligence officer, on November 14, 1940, the British decode a German message about an impending attack on the English city of Coventry. If Churchill tries to protect Coventry, he could tip off the Germans that he's reading their messages.
It must have been a very, very difficult position to be placed in, and very difficult decision for him to make. And in this particular case, he was looking at the long-term Allied victory, and he essentially sacrificed the citizens of Coventry that were lost that night.
Coventry is devastated from the air. The destruction is so complete, the Germans coin a new phrase, Coventrated, to describe total obliteration of a town. The story is controversial, as there is no hard evidence to support the claim that Churchill was warned about the Coventry attack. As D-Day approaches, the Allies discover through Ultra and their network of spies that the Nazis still believe the invasion will come through Calais. Still, attacking Normandy will be difficult, as the Germans establish defenses all along the coast. Sun Tzu would praise the Allies' preparation for the landing and their mastery of deception, but he would seriously condemn what they do once they arrive. Sun Tzu says, when a falcon strike breaks the body of its prey, it is because of timing. When torrential water tosses boulders, it is because of momentum. Sun Tzu believes even the most well-executed attack can be ruined if momentum is lost. The Normandy invasion shows that Sun Tzu could have predicted its outcome some 2,000 years earlier. After months of preparation and deception, Eisenhower launches his attack against German-occupied France. 150,000 ground troops, jammed onto hundreds of small landing craft, leave England and cross the English Channel. They'll land at 5 different beaches in France, codenamed Juno, Sword, Gold, Utah, and Omaha. As the landing craft approach the beaches, 15,000 aircraft and 7,000 ships provide a coordinated aerial assault on the beaches. At some of the landing sites, the Allied soldiers meet very little resistance. But at beaches like Omaha, it's hell on earth. For many of the Allied soldiers inside the landing craft, these moments before the door opens will be their last.
A case of incredible courage in the face of overwhelming horror. I mean, if you think about it, the landing crafts came up to the beach, and as they came up to the beach, the troops inside the landing craft could hear the machine guns tattering on the outside. The enemy machine gun is switched to what they call FCL, Final Coordination Line. They're going to put as much machine gun fire on the front of that boat, so when it drops, bullets go right through it, kill 2 or 3 guys at a time. A lot of guys used to die that way.
Many don't make it off the boats. For the soldier lucky enough to survive the initial machine gun barrage, the nightmare is just beginning. He then has to cross 200 yards of mined tidal flats, weighed down with wet, heavy gear. Then get through another 100 yards of barbed wire beaches. It's 3 football fields of death and destruction as German machine guns shred fellow soldiers and friends.
If you ever get a chance to visit Omaha, it will change your whole view about the world. It will change your whole view about America. It will make you realize what incredible heroism was displayed by those guys there.
The Allies survive on dead ground exactly the way Sun Tzu predicts, by fighting together and never giving up.
There was unmitigated horror, and still they kept coming. And you wonder, why, how do you make people do that? And perhaps Sun Tzu is in fact instructive here. You make them do that because there's no other alternative except death. What are you going to do? Turn around with the equipment and swim back to England? There's no plan for evacuation unless you're wounded. There's no way you could refuse to get off the boat. So, in a sense, once you put that number of guys on the beach, you're following Sun Tzu in that you're putting an army in a situation where it must fight or die. And they fought well, and they survived.
The Allies also benefit from another Sun Tzu principle, the poor judgment of their enemy's leader. Sun Tzu says it is essential for victory that generals are unconstrained by their leaders. The Allied command structure gives total authority to General Eisenhower as supreme commander of all forces on the Western Front. Beneath him are 4 commanders, one for the Navy, Air Force, the U.S. Army Group, and the British Army Group. In the business world, this would be a very clean org chart with well-defined responsibilities.
The great advantage that Eisenhower had that he could work with all sorts of people, and there were a huge number of prima donnas, and on both sides he was able to work with these people and get them to work for the common good.
One would expect a dictator like Hitler to have an even more efficient chain of command than the Allies, but it's just the opposite. Hitler sets up a confusing system of overlapping authority.
He wanted to make sure that no one person beneath him had all of the information and or all of the control over forces at their disposal. And so by divvying it up, it always ensured that Hitler was the one that actually made the final decision on the disposition and the allocation of troops.
General von Rundstedt holds the title of Commander-in-Chief for forces in the West, but the Navy and Air Fleet each had separate command chains that aren't under his control and often don't cooperate with each other. The Waffen-SS, a separate military arm that fights alongside the German army, answers to Himmler, and Rundstedt has only indirect control of the mechanized divisions. 4 tank units are under his command, but the remaining 6 are split between Army Groups B and G. It's a complete mess.
Hitler's leadership style and the chaotic command structure in the German army render Hitler a very cooperative adversary for a Sun Tzu-type campaign. He's constantly interfering in the decisions of his subordinates, the generals who should be acting objectively and professionally in trying to defend France against the Allied invasion.
One of Hitler's greatest blunders is how he deployed his prized Panzer tank divisions. Some generals believe the Panzers must be close to the beaches to knock the invading troops back into the sea. Others think the tanks should be held in reserve so they can be deployed in force wherever the Allies choose to land. Since none of the generals have the authority to make the call, the decision falls to Hitler.
And being Hitler, he made all the wrong decisions. He put one Panzer division in Holland and another Panzer division at the Bay of Biscay, both of which were entirely out of any range of a possible landing. And he put the rest of his Panzer divisions back at some distance from the beaches.
Hitler's failure is a perfect example of why Sun Tzu says the enlightened general must be free to conduct war without interference from the leader.
When you look at the strategy for the German defense in France or in Normandy, it's very divided over how the defense should be arranged, what forces are actually available to defend the beaches, and what forces are actually available to reinforce the beaches or reinforce the German forces at the invasion point, because no one person has control of all of the forces, as Eisenhower did on the Allied side.
The Allies achieve the impossible. Through bravery and determination, the troops are able to take all 5 landing sites at Normandy.
Despite all of the complex planning that went into the invasion of Normandy, it was the small unit tactics and the buddies fighting side by side that wins the Battle of the Beaches, and that's consistent throughout history.
Sun Tzu would have marveled at the timing and execution of the invasion. But soon, the Allies encounter a new and completely unexpected enemy. A labyrinth of giant, impenetrable hedgerows in what is known as the Bocage country of France.
It looks like the Allies have pulled off this amazing, miraculous feat, and they have. They've landed an army on the beaches of Normandy. But then they get bogged down in the hedgerow country. They had not anticipated that, despite the fact that the reconnaissance aircraft had photographed these hedgerows. The Allied planners simply assumed that these were like the hedges in a suburban backyard. 4 or 5 feet tall, maybe.
But these ancient hedges, dating back nearly 2,000 years, are 20 to 30 feet tall and extremely thick. They can't be climbed, tanks can't maneuver through them safely, and explosives would give away a unit's position.
The hedgerow country in Normandy threatens to completely undermine the momentum that the Allies need to build up.
The American army is a mechanized army, and you can't move tanks and trucks very quickly through hedgerows that are enormously thick.
The Allies' momentum stops dead in its tracks. 40 days pass, and they have only reached their Day 5 objectives. Casualties amount to more than 78,000, and the entire invasion is in jeopardy. But the solution on how to escape this enormous maze lies in the pages of Sun Tzu's Art of War. Sun Tzu says, "Make your enemy prepare on his left, and he will be weak on his right." In Normandy, France, the Allies are getting pummeled in the hedgerows of the Bocage country. Terrain perfectly suited for German ambushes and snipers.
The Germans have a word for close order combat in terrain that's very complex and closed. It's called Rattenkrieg. It means literally the war of the rats. It means, in essence, that warfare gets reduced to almost individual combat. 1 or 2 men against 1 or 2 men, because the terrain, in this case the hedgerows, won't allow you to maneuver. Won't allow you to bring your technological advances of artillery, air power, mobility to tanks to bear. So the war in the hedgerows was a terrible war. It was up close and personal.
But perhaps what's most deadly in the hedgerows are the German panzer tanks prowling the maze.
The British actually had a pamphlet on how to hunt tanks. They would send out specialized teams of individuals with bazookas or Piats, as the British and the Canadian armies called them, in order to actually hunt down tanks and take them out. And the manual actually likens it to big game hunting, where you're out stalking a tiger or an elephant and trying to take it down.
Eventually, the Allies devise a Sun Tzu-inspired strategy to help free themselves from the carnage of the Bocage country. The plan is to lure most of the German forces fighting at the Bocage to the city of Caen, so a weakened force is left behind.
Primarily because Caen had airfields and it was closest to Paris, and so the Germans were fairly sure that we would attack through Caen.
The Allied plan begins with Operation Goodwood, a blistering barrage of air power against the city of Caen. The Germans take the bait and move many of their panzer tank divisions away from the Bocage, leaving only 1.5 divisions behind to hold back the U.S. forces in the hedgerows. The U.S. immediately takes advantage of the shift and strikes with a withering air attack on the remaining German panzer tank divisions. It's called Operation Cobra.
Sun Tzu says is, you must behave like the snake. Why? So that when you are attacked on the front, the back will reinforce the front. You attack in the rear, the front can reinforce that point, and you attack the middle. Both sides will come in. So for Sun Tzu, right, it is really that the enemy attacking you. In your responses, you must be flexible.
With nearly all of the German tanks destroyed, U.S. forces are able to punch a hole in the German line with artillery, tanks, and infantry. Finally, after weeks of frustration, the Allies break out of the bocage. The diversion of Goodwood at Caen and the success of Cobra in the bocage country changes the strategic equation. The stalled Allied momentum returns with a vengeance. Throughout the Normandy invasion, Sun Tzu's invisible hand guides the Allies to victory through their use of deception, foreknowledge, and a superior command structure that motivates the entire army to fight as one. Sun Tzu says, the winning army realizes the conditions for victory first, then fights. The losing army fights first, then seeks victory. The battle between the kingdoms of Wu and Chu rages. Sun Tzu's small Wu force is on death ground. They are surrounded by the army of the Chu Prime Minister, Nang Hua. But Sun Tzu is worried. While Nang Hua's army attacks, Sun Tzu's main force is headed to capture the Chu capital of Ying.
When Nang Hua realizes that Sun Tzu's main force is bent on the attack on Ying, he has a tough decision to make. Obviously, he wants to kill Sun Tzu. He wants to wipe out this force under Sun Tzu's command. But while he doesn't think the Wu force, the main body, is much of a threat to the Chu capital, he's afraid that the defender of Ying, another general, will win credit for defending the capital against the Wu forces. As a result, he races back to defend Ying.
It will be Nang Hua's most colossal mistake of the war. Like Nang Hua, generals throughout history have charged headlong into battle without having all the information they need. Thousands of years later, in the farmlands of Pennsylvania, another general rushes into battle without knowing what lies ahead. He is Confederate General Robert E. Lee, who some consider the greatest commander in American history. But at Gettysburg, Lee fails to heed Sun Tzu's wisdom and pays a terrible price. Sun Tzu says, no nation has ever benefited from prolonged war. The American Civil War is Sun Tzu's nightmare scenario. A bloody stalemate that will end up costing more than 620,000 lives, by far the deadliest war in American history.
By 1863, it's pretty clear on both sides that this is not going to be the short war everyone thought it was going to be when, at the Battle of Manassas, the ladies and gentlemen drove out of D.C. in their carriages with picnic lunches to observe what they thought would be the first and last battle of the war. Everybody knows now it's going to be a long war.
The war affects every American, sometimes in unexpected ways. The Civil War sees the creation of the first American psychiatric hospital at St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C., still in operation today. The war between the North and South also affected how Americans receive their mail. A Cleveland postmaster becomes so distraught by the sight of anxious wives and children lining up at his post office that he institutes home delivery for the very first time, though what many homes receive are death notices.
The turkey buzzards realized that whenever they saw an army, that sooner or later there would be flesh to eat. And as the armies moved along, they often moved along with hundreds of turkey buzzards overhead, just waiting for the battlefield, waiting for the carnage, waiting for the open wounds, peck out their eyes, and eat the innards as they would any other carrion. And almost a horrific scene, but that's what war is. pretty horrific at times.
Civil War field hospitals are human butcher shops, with arms and legs stacked in piles. Some 40,000 amputations are performed on the Union side alone, only 24,000 of them under anesthesia. Doctors perform dozens of surgeries without ever washing their hands.
It was 7 times safer to fight through the entire Battle of Gettysburg than it was to be sent to an Army hospital. The death rate there was 30 and 40%. Taking the limb off was just one part of it. Now you had the problem of gangrene, suppuration, infection, and the death rates were just staggeringly high.
The American Civil War is a classic example of why Sun Tzu warns against going to war in the first place. But other principles in the art of war will prove instrumental in how the war eventually ends. Sun Tzu says, "Those skilled in war bring the enemy to the field of battle. They are not brought by him." Pennsylvania, 1863. The Civil War is a bloody stalemate. By the end of June of that year, Confederate General Robert E. Lee boldly moves his army of nearly 60,000 men into Union territory. While most of the battles of the American Civil War have been fought in the South, Lee decides the moment is right to invade Union soil. Lee's plan? Destroy as many military posts as possible in Maryland and Pennsylvania, while Union armies defend Washington, D.C. One key target is Camp Curtin, outside of Harrisburg, the largest military supply depot in the North.
The strategy of Lee's attack on the North is not primarily military, it's primarily political. And he's going to try to essentially to defeat Lincoln politically. What he hopes is a massive defeat of the North will encourage people to lose faith in the war.
Lee's bold military action to achieve a political victory is more of a go strategy than a chess strategy. Exactly the kind of plan Sun Tzu would have admired. But as Lee's main force moves north, a skirmish erupts in Gettysburg between 2 cavalry units.
Confederate General Heath had a division at Cashtown, and he wanted to move over to Gettysburg in order to get some shoes that were in a factory there. That was the only reason he went. In this fashion, he moved without any understanding of what lay ahead of him, and in the process set off the greatest war that's ever been fought in the Western Hemisphere.
Lee gets word of the skirmish and is told that a major Union force is at Gettysburg. Instead of sending a cavalry reconnaissance force to confirm the report, Lee orders his entire army to mobilize. It's a colossal mistake.
Lee decides to abandon the original plan. He gives up what we call strategic aim, and he makes the mistake of allowing operational developments to drive strategy.
Lee orders all his forces to converge at Cashtown, a small village 7 miles from Gettysburg. Sun Tzu would not like his choice, as Cashtown has not been fully scouted.
Had Robert E. Lee read Sun Tzu, he would have known better than to proceed on what you think is happening and try to expend the resources to find out what really is happening.
Sun Tzu says, "Move only when you see an advantage and there is something to gain. Only fight if a position is critical." Some 60,000 Confederate troops begin to pour in from nearby Cashtown and Carlisle. 3,000 Union soldiers take position on McPherson Ridge. They try to hold off the onslaught of enemy soldiers until help arrives. But reinforcements are miles away toward Washington, D.C. So the Union soldiers withdraw southeast onto Cemetery Ridge, a range of hills that forms the shape of a fishhook. Cemetery Ridge provides an extremely strong defensive advantage.
The terrain is so obvious in favor of the defense that my guess is almost any second lieutenant from West Point would have chosen that ground given the opportunity to do it.
When Union General Hancock arrives, he declares it the best natural position he's ever seen. Lee immediately sees the danger of the Union's position. But because Union troops are still straggling in, he believes they are vulnerable. Lee then gives an order to Confederate General Ewell that many believe isn't really an order at all.
And Lee says to him, attack when you think it's practicable. Didn't order him to attack. Ewell, new on the battlefield, doesn't know what the hell's going on, and decides not to attack.
Ewell decided that it was not practical because his troops were tired and they were exhausted, and he wanted a rest.
While some criticize Ewell for not following orders, Sun Tzu's own words place the blame on Lee.
If we look all the way back to this famous interview between King Helu of Wu and Sun Tzu, in that incident with the palace concubines, the importance of clarity in orders. Sun Tzu says at that point, if the orders are unclear, it is the fault of the general. At Gettysburg, we see Lee issuing very unclear and very ambiguous orders to his subordinates.
Union reinforcements soon arrive and strengthen their position. Lee now faces an uphill battle. Sun Tzu says, when the enemy occupies high ground, do not confront him. If he attacks downhill, do not oppose him. As night falls on the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee confers with another Confederate general, James Longstreet, a man who grasps the situation from Sun Tzu's perspective. Longstreet wants Lee to abandon the idea of attacking the Union high ground. Instead, he wants to march south around Cemetery Ridge, then east right toward Washington, D.C.
And this will force the Union Army to come off Cemetery Ridge and attack us where we are. And if they attack us, we will win. This would have been precisely what Sun Tzu would have recommended.
But Lee says no. He points to Cemetery Ridge and says, the enemy is there, and I am going to attack him there. Lee has completely given up his go strategy and reverts back to chess.
Longstreet is stunned. He sees the Union Army dug in on the hills and knows that they should not be attacked. Sun Tzu would have advised against it. He would have said, assess the situation, adjust your forces, find another way to attack the enemy.
But Lee doesn't listen. The second day of Gettysburg is hell on earth. Bucolic pastures are transformed into fields of slaughter. Places like Plum Run, the Peach Orchard, and Little Round Top see some of the bloodiest hand-to-hand combat of the war.
What's terrible about hand-to-hand combat is the memories. You know, for a lot of war, you can pull the trigger and maybe you see somebody drop. Maybe. Most often you don't. But this is up close and personal. It's bayonets, knives, rifle butts, pistol shots in the head, in the face, and you see it. And it takes a piece out of you. And that's why you have psychiatric casualties. God knows how many members of both sides remember that battle, you know, every night for the rest of their lives. And it's just gory beyond belief.
On top of Little Round Top is Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine Regiment. They have survived 3 Confederate charges and are nearly out of ammunition.
And here comes the 4th attack. And Chamberlain orders fixed bayonets. Everybody fires the last 2 rounds they got, stands up, and in a great moment in history, stands on the wall with a saber and gives the command, which rings through the years of American infantry history. Follow me, boys. Bayonets forward. And down they go.
Union troops howl down the hill. Shocked at the charge, the Confederate soldiers retreat. Against all odds, the Union hangs on to Little Round Top. Sun Tzu's principle of never attacking an enemy on high ground holds true. But this does not seem to deter Li, for he's going to ignore Sun Tzu yet again and order his men to attack uphill one more time. Sun Tzu says, there are some armies that should not be fought, some ground that should not be contested. The sun rises on the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg. Despite the thousands of dead bodies strewn across the fields, Confederate General Robert E. Lee is about to order his troops to attack the high ground yet again.
One of the things you never want to do in war, never throw good money after bad. Follow the advice of Sun Tzu. Use an attack to exploit a victory. Never use an attack to rescue a defeat. And Longstreet gets it.
General Longstreet once again suggests to Lee that they should move around Cemetery Ridge and threaten Washington, D.C. to draw the Union off the high ground.
Longstreet understands that the Confederates are in a terrible position. They are outnumbered. They do not have the high ground. They have suffered terrible casualties in the last 2 days of fighting, and that there's no real chance of pushing the Union Army off the high ground.
But Lee feels his men have sacrificed too much to turn back now. Lee gives the order to attack. The infantry charge is led by Major General George Pickett.
The story is Dutch Longstreet is sitting there, and Pickett says, "Shall I go, General? Shall I go?" And Longstreet just drops his head. He looks away. "General, shall I go?" And Longstreet again looks away. He said, "General, I'm going into the attack." And Longstreet looked again away. Longstreet never gave the order to attack. He knew it was suicidal.
In the sweltering July heat, 12,500 Confederate soldiers led by Pickett make their determined march across an open field nearly a mile long. As they advance in close ranks, thousands are cut down by Union artillery and rifle fire.
There was nowhere they could hide. There was almost no range between the Union forces and the Confederate forces, and the Union forces were simply able to stand behind these reinforced positions and fire on the Confederates, and so the Confederates had no way of defending themselves.
To Pickett's men's bravery, they continued all the way out. And there's one whole unit from South Carolina that marched straight into the Rhode Island artillery guns. It was destroyed by canister shot. The whole unit died instantaneously. Just tore through people's limbs, heads, eyes, blood, hair, and eyeballs everywhere.
Of the more than 12,000 Confederate soldiers who made the charge, only 5,000 survived. The Battle of Gettysburg is over.
Sun Tzu would have been horrified at the tragic waste of Pickett's charge. Sun Tzu always believed in using the intellect rather than force, and never attacking headlong an enemy force if he could do otherwise.
At Gettysburg, Lee doesn't adjust his strategy to the situations on the ground. He refuses to retreat, even when the situation is clearly hopeless.
And Lee takes off his hat, dismounts, and walks into the field and says, "It's all my fault, boys. It's all my fault." "You're damn right, General. It's all your fault. No one in his right mind would have ordered that. You should have listened to Sun Tzu."
In the end, his failure to follow Sun Tzu's wisdom is one of the factors that costs the Confederates the war. Sun Tzu says, when troops flee, are insubordinate, collapse, or are routed in battle, it is the fault of the general. In The Art of War, Sun Tzu imagines the role of the supreme general. a man who must be intelligent and cunning, never rash nor arrogant. Exactly the opposite of Sun Tzu's adversary in the Wu-Chu War, Nanhua.
Sun Tzu is deadly against impulsive behavior, rash behavior, or making the army march double quick time in order to seize victory. For in Sun Tzu's mind, victory comes from deep thinking, from detailed calculation, from long preparation.
While Nanhua has a larger, more powerful army, Sun Tzu shows he is the master by outwitting his enemy. Nanhua rushes to his capital, believing Sun Tzu is about to invade, but the master never had any intention of attacking such a well-protected city. It's a ruse to lure Nanhua into a trap, and it works perfectly. Without warning, more than 20,000 of Sun Tzu's elite warriors ambushed Nanhua's forces. The surprise attack throws Nanhua's men into confusion.
What we have now is a series of running battles between Nanhua's much depleted forces and Sun Tzu's main force. In each battle, Nanhua gets weaker, Sun Tzu gets stronger, and the Wu-Chu capital lays exposed.
Sun Tzu joins up with his main force and attacks the disorganized Chu army. Finally, Sun Tzu has won the war. Through preparation, deception, and indirect attacks, Sun Tzu pulls off one of the greatest upsets in history. But as mysteriously as he arrived, Sun Tzu leaves and disappears.
There's some speculation as to why he disappears. One theory is that the behavior of the leaders of Wu shock him, discourage him. When the king of Wu enters the Chu capital, he's dumbstruck by its wealth. He becomes greedy and covetous. It would seem then that Sun Tzu has provided this ambitious and potentially corrupt king with a dangerous instrument, this new military that he's honed. He also sees infighting breaking out, and perhaps this is the moment that Sun Tzu retires from this life and goes instead to write what he sees as the lessons of the conflict between Wu and Chu.
The first line of Sun Tzu's Art of War is, "War is a matter of vital importance to the state. It is a matter of life and death, survival or ruin." Sun Tzu knows that war can lead to disaster. Sometimes, the best way to win is not to fight at all. This is perhaps Sun Tzu's ultimate secret.
Nations often rush into wars with very little concern for thinking through what the total cost is going to be, not just in dollars, but also in terms of human suffering, not only to you, but to the civilians and children of the country in which you're fighting. It's the kind of thing that we find in Sun Tzu, that before you go to war, think this through, and then ask yourself: is the reasons for which you're fighting worth the total cost of the war, or is there another way?
As Sun Tzu says, the angry can be made happy again, but the dead cannot be brought back to life. Still, some historians believe the genius behind the art of war wasn't actually Sun Tzu, but a collection of different strategists. While his existence is debated, his legacy isn't. Today, the art of war is read by generals, CEOs, and professional sports coaches. And while it offers us insights into the battles of the past, it could prepare us for the wars of the future.
Sun Tzu is extremely relevant to us today because the rules that he laid down 400 BC are the same rules that we apply to warfare today, or should apply to warfare today. The the recommendations for indirect warfare that we learned from Sun Tzu are the way we need to fight wars today, because there's no way we can continue to fight direct, heavy, conventional wars, because no other army is going to attack us in a conventional fashion. We're going to have to use the indirect methods of dealing with the enemy that Sun Tzu recommended, and the quicker we learn these, the more likely we're to be successful in our wars of the future.
Sun Tzu can teach us not merely to know ourselves, to know our strengths, our weaknesses, what we're capable of doing on the battlefield, but constantly reminds us that is as important, if not more so, to cultivate a deep, fundamental understanding of our adversaries so that we might better achieve our objectives. That's what I think makes it a possession for all time.
Throughout history, Sun Tzu's principles have guided the outcome of war. We must embrace his wisdom or fight in darkness.
Take on the entire continent at Waterloo. One last campaign to reclaim his empire or surrender forever. darkest hour, a conqueror's resurrection begins with his destruction. April 12th, 1814. The man who had all of Europe at his feet is about to have his empire ripped from his grasp. Napoleon Bonaparte once terrorized the entire continent. Now he faces a terror of his own, the humiliation of defeat. Yesterday, his enemies, the Allies, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, forced him to surrender his crown. Napoleon's ambition had cost France close to 1 million men. With the stroke of a quill, it's over. His empire had devoured land from Moscow to Egypt. Now it's gone, leaving France a shadow of her former glory. The emperor faces a grim future. His enemies have stormed the gates of Paris. And condemned him to life in exile. Terrified of what lies ahead and haunted by the past, Bonaparte calls it quits. He downs a heavy dose of poison. After 2 decades of conquest, Napoleon is giving up.
Napoleon clearly feels that the game is up. All the hopes that he's trying to wriggle out of this desperate situation, he suddenly finds that there's nothing else to do.
He wanted to go out in a blaze of glory, and if he couldn't do it by winning, he wanted to do it by dying as gloriously as possible while he was still emperor.
Napoleon's determination propelled him from the hills of Corsica to the streets of the French Revolution, from the battlefields of Russia to the throne of a French empire that rivaled ancient Rome.
When Napoleon was just 23 years old, he was still unknown. 4 years later, he was the greatest general France had seen in centuries. 2 years after that, he was the ruler of France. 6 years after that, he ruled the largest empire that Europe had seen, probably since the Romans.
Napoleon was traumatized by the thought that with this signature, it was all going to end in a twinkling.
His imperial dream snuffed out, Napoleon is determined to die with it. But the poison doesn't work. He begs his doctor for a heavier, fatal dose. But the doctor refuses to finish him off.
I am not an assassin. Empereur! Empereur!
Napoleon had gambled his empire and lost it all. But the emperor is far from finished. While Napoleon laments his past, the Allies plot his future. They draft the Treaty of Fontainebleau, dictating the terms of his abdication and his sentence to exile. But the Allies still face a dilemma. Where do you cage a tiger? They decide on a little island called Elba, just 6 miles off the coast of Italy. The Allies even allow Napoleon to keep an imperial title, Emperor of Elba.
Elba had the advantage of being an island. easily controlled, easily patrolled.
Well, before Napoleon's arrival, Elba is a pretty small backwater.
He was still allowed to keep his title of emperor. He was allowed to have an allowance from the French government of 2 million francs a year.
Napoleon is too big a character to live on such a tiny place. It's like you've been managing a company and then you're asked to be the janitor.
But many of the delegates fear that Elba is too close to Europe to keep such a dangerous force bottled up for long. Getting to Elba means surviving a journey through a hostile land, France. The country is full of people who now despise him, and he knows how dangerous angry crowds can be, from experience, 22 years before. August 1792. The Revolution. King Louis XVI was under attack as the French took to the streets of Paris, calling for democracy. At 23, Napoleon was swept up in the tide. On August 10th, a mob marched on the Tuileries Palace to confront the king. Napoleon had a front row view. What he saw would scar him forever. The mob slaughtered the king's guards, tearing their corpses to pieces.
Napoleon said it was worse than any battlefield he had seen. It was carnage.
Napoleon was absolutely horrified by this. He was someone who had a great deal of enthusiasm for the revolution. But when he saw this bloodshed, it simply confirmed in him a disdain, a contempt for the crowd.
3 years later, Napoleon's contempt for mob rule catapulted him to the front ranks of the revolution. October 5th, 1795. A mob of the king's supporters marched on the revolutionary parliament. Napoleon received orders to stop the attack and seized the moment to make his mark.
In the late summer of 1795, there were royalist protesters in Paris who wanted to overthrow the government, and the government called out the standing army. This was the first time in the history of the French Revolution that the army had been called out to suppress the crowds. The mob approached, swelling to more than 20,000. Napoleon ordered his cannon loaded not with cannonballs, but with grape shot, small pellets, to hit more bodies with every blast.
They dragged the cannons up to a church in central Paris called Saint-Roch, not far from the Tuileries Palace, and as the royalists streamed down towards this church, Napoleon famously shouts, "Fire!"
The crowd was mowed down en masse.
It was just massive carnage, blood and death, and the crowd realized in one swoop, this was not crowd control like they'd ever known.
Napoleon would later boast that he cleared the streets of Paris with a whiff of grape shot. His reward was a promotion to Major General. He had made his mark by soaking the streets of Paris with French blood. Just a hint of the horrors to come. "19 years later, Napoleon confronts his own horror. Having failed to kill himself, he faces a bleak future of exile.
Since death is no more willing to take me in bed than on the battlefield, I shall go on.
A British colonel, Neil Campbell, is to escort Napoleon to Elba and spy on him in exile. When Campbell arrives at Fontainebleau, he finds the ex-emperor a nervous wreck. Napoleon agonizes over his defeat. paces constantly, chewing his knuckles raw.
Napoleon certainly had reason to fear assassination, and by 1814 he was really hated by a lot of the French.
France was filled with, at this point, a great number of royalists who loathed and hated Napoleon and would have been happy to kill him. And so there was good reason to think that he could have been assassinated.
On his last day at Fontainebleau, Napoleon bids farewell to his most loyal troops, the famous French Imperial Guard.
I have sacrificed all my rights, and I'm ready to sacrifice myself. For all my life has been devoted to the happiness and glory of France.
With a last cry, long live the Emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte begins the dreaded journey into exile. The road south carries him deep into a hostile world. If he has any hope of winning back his people, he will have to survive them first.
People were very angry with Napoleon because he had been promising them victories. He had been promising them one more effort, and the empire will be established. And they had again and again provided armies with a kind of loyalty that no other general had enjoyed in modern history. And then it ended in a catastrophe.
There are large parts of France that are unhappy with the way the regime has ended, and they want him to suffer for it.
At Moulins, royalists swarm the carriage, shouting, "Long live the king!" Napoleon orders the driver to pick up the pace. At Orgon, an effigy of Napoleon hangs from a makeshift gallows. Its sign threatens, sooner or later, this will be the tyrant's fate. Terrified, Napoleon disguises himself as a courier. It's a humiliation he hasn't felt since he first came to France as a child, 35 years before. April 23rd, 1779. A 9-year-old boy arrived from Corsica to study at the elite French military school in Brienne. But young Napoleone Bonaparte could barely speak French. His classmates were merciless. They ridiculed his Italian accent and backward country manners.
Napoleon was exotic for them. He was an oddity. He came from Corsica. He spoke French with a heavy accent.
He's only recently just learned French, really, and they make fun of him. They make his name sound like a piece of straw on your nose. Instead of Napoleon, it sounds like Napoleone, which means in French, you've got a piece of straw on your nose.
The Corsican boy grew bitter. He called his classmates hereditary asses, the scourge of the nation. He declared, "I shall do these French all the harm I can." Napoleon graduated in 1784 and entered the École Royale Militaire. He soon became a French patriot and would bring both harm and glory to the French people he once revived. "30 years later, Napoleon takes his last steps on his beloved French soil. Fearful of assassination, he sails for Elba in the safety of a British vessel rather than a French ship. He boards the HMS Undaunted and requests a 21-gun salute as Emperor of the island of Elba. As Napoleon is shipped off into exile, his enemies gather to toast the tyrant's defeat. The Allies, Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, plot the course of France's future. Amidst the world-class schemers, one Machiavellian icon stands alone, Napoleon's longtime advisor, Charles Maurice Talleyrand.
Talleyrand served 6 regimes and betrayed 4. He is among your most talented and bright, but most duplicitous characters of all in the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic period.
Talleyrand is one of the incredible characters of this period. He was born into a great French noble family. He embraced the revolution and then managed to stay active in almost every regime that followed for the next 30 years.
With Napoleon gone, Talleyrand switches sides to the Allies and weasels his way back to power. But a cloud of doubt hangs over the proceedings. Is Elba really far enough away? One official comments that putting Napoleon on Elba is like having Vesuvius next door to Naples.
When would the explosion occur? When would those 7 miles be crossed? When would Napoleon come back? It was just a matter of time.
An island prison would prove no match for a force as powerful as Napoleon Bonaparte. May 1814. The British frigate the Undaunted arrives at the island of Elba and discharges its precious cargo. The island's new emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte. Only 6 miles from the Italian coast, this speck of land is where Napoleon will be confined, for now. A welcoming committee whisks Napoleon to his new imperial capital, the village of Porto Ferraio. Town hall has been converted into an improvised palace. The emperor's new throne is an old, threadbare sofa. The rest of his island is a disease-ridden rock, only 17 miles long. With a population of 12,000, mostly peasants, it's a feeble substitute for the empire he created and ruled for 15 years.
From the moment Napoleon set foot on Elba, he was thinking how he could recommence his fabulous destiny.
But when Napoleon got to Elba, clearly he was thinking about ways to return to France. He was not somebody who was ready to settle down in retirement in a place like Elba, not yet.
But while Napoleon takes stock of his new home, someone else is getting comfortable in his old one. Tuileries Palace in Paris. Napoleon's old co-conspirator Talleyrand has made himself kingmaker. The man he props up on the throne is the brother of the deceased Louis XVI. Louis XVIII weighs in as the latest Bourbon king of France. But his 300-pound figure hardly inspires enthusiasm in the people.
Louis XVIII was fat, he was gouty, there were all sorts of rumors about his impotence. He was not a charismatic figure in the least, and nobody can be very charismatic in comparison with Napoleon.
Louis inherits a shattered economy, decimated by Napoleon's wars. He slashes the army's budget, throwing 250,000 soldiers out of work. As an insult, he stiffs Napoleon, refusing to pay his pension.
Obviously, among the people still loyal to Napoleon, particularly in the army, this did not go over well at all.
Bankrupt, Napoleon chafes in his island prison. Exile is unacceptable, especially for a man who's worked miracles since he first led men to war 18 years before. March 1796. After Napoleon's triumphant whiff of grape shot, One French official warns, promote this man, or he will promote himself. At 26 years old, Bonaparte was a major general with a thankless mission: the endless campaign against Austria for control of northern Italy. The young general took command of an army of some 40,000 hungry and ill-equipped men.
When Napoleon took over the army of Italy in 1796, it was in desperate shape. The men did not have enough to eat, their uniforms were in tatters. Above all, they didn't have the boots to march.
One of his famous declarations is, you are poorly fed, you are poorly dressed, and you've got no food, but we're going to win anyway.
Napoleon taught his men to live off the land. He camped with them, ate with them, won their undying devotion.
Napoleon was a psychologist of his men. At the moments of greatest pain and likeliest defeat, he was able to win superhuman amounts of suffering and devotion.
But Bonaparte's obsession was speed. He raced his troops across the Alps, marching into battle at a pace his enemies never anticipated.
Napoleon moves faster and thinks faster than everybody else. His standard military credo is to make sure that I have more troops at any specific moment than the opponent. He always knows when is just the right moment to launch the attack.
In April 1796, Napoleon's troops stormed into northern Italy. In less than 2 weeks, he ended a war that had dragged on for years. He then took the battle to the Austrians. In the border town of Lodi, he marched his troops over a bridge and straight into the Austrian guns. His men charged into a death trap. But French cavalry swooped in on the Austrians, handing the lucky General Bonaparte a surprise victory.
It wasn't any great battle. In fact, it was a bit of a mess. It wasn't a particularly great performance by Napoleon or by his army, but he won the battle and started to establish the legend.
Napoleon is a great publicist. He is the master of spin. Throughout the whole of the Italian campaign, he's publishing his own newspapers, which say things like, floats like a butterfly, stings like a bee. This is the kind of thing he's printing in his own newspapers about himself.
Over time, Napoleon transformed the near disaster at Lodi into an act of battlefield brilliance. His Italian triumph made him the most popular and powerful soldier in France.
The results of the first Italian campaign for Napoleon were extraordinary. French generals had been trying to conquer northern Italy for centuries, and none of them had succeeded. Napoleon not only succeeded, but seemed to do so almost effortlessly. He did what nobody else had done previously. That was enough to establish him as the most important general in France.
But the hero's public confidence evaporated in private. He could redraw the boundaries of Europe. There was still one thing he couldn't control: his wife. Just 2 days before marching off to Italy, Napoleon had married a woman 6 years his senior, Josephine de Beauharnais.
Josephine de Beauharnais was a very unlikely wife for Napoleon. She was older than he was. She was a Creole, originally from the island of Martinique in the Caribbean. She had been widowed when her husband was sent to the guillotine in the Revolution.
Napoleon is obsessed with Josephine. He's completely bowled over by her, as we see from the early letters. These extraordinary, passionate letters that he writes day after day.
The lovesick general poured out his passion in daily letters from the battlefront. Josephine sent almost nothing in response. Her silence drove him to the brink of madness.
I shall go berserk if I do not have a letter from you tomorrow. Never has destiny resisted my will.
Napoleon insisted on constant displays of love from Josephine.
There's one of the letters where he talks about, if you don't write back to me one of these days, I shall burst back in and I shall fly through the window and stab you with my little sword. And you think, little sword. So it is his little sword. So I think there's a metaphor for his little sword. I don't think it's a real sword that he's actually wielding there.
The anxious young general would eventually turn his back on love and channel all his passion into what he knew: warfare. Now, 18 years later, in the summer of 1814, Napoleon summons up his energy for a new campaign. Life in a cage, trapped on a Mediterranean backwater, will never satisfy his ambition.
He had been the master of all of Europe, everywhere from Portugal to Moscow, and to stuff him on an island that is 16 miles long and its wide as 7 miles with 12,000 inhabitants just wasn't going to do.
When you are on a small island, once you have set in motion the machinery of civilization, there is nothing left to do but perish from the boredom, or to get away from it by some heroic venture.
Napoleon Bonaparte is about to launch an attack that will shake all of Europe. February 1815. Napoleon Bonaparte has been caged on Elba for 10 months. But even in exile, ambition dies hard, and he gives his island prison an imperial makeover.
Napoleon took the job of government seriously, and Elba was another chance to modernize, and I think then he ran out of things to do.
Life in Elba begins to mimic Parisian society. Tourists flock to the island, eager for a glimpse of Europe's caged eagle. Napoleon probes his visitors for information. What's the political climate in France? How would he be received if he returned?
He keeps up the run of Elba social life, he keeps the Kingdom of Elba running, and at the same time he is in contact with Bonapartist supporters in France.
Elba was not at the far end of the planet. It was easy for him to have news of Europe, of the continent of France. Napoleon was well aware of what was taking place in France and in Vienna.
While the Allies redraw the map of France, Napoleon plots an escape from Elba and a campaign to reclaim his throne. The plan requires total secrecy. Elba's token military comes complete with a warship, the Inconstant. Disguised as a British naval vessel, it'll make the perfect vehicle for his escape. Napoleon prepares to unleash his great weapons, speed and surprise, to re-establish his empire. His quest is a long shot, but not for a man who dreamed of ruling the entire world and almost pulled it off. May 1798. Young General Bonaparte dreamed of conquest. His global ambition found an ally, Talleyrand. The devious foreign minister suggested he begin with Egypt. The British dominated world trade. To destroy their monopoly, Talleyrand convinced Napoleon to cut off their supply routes in Cairo. May 19th, Napoleon set sail with more than 35,000 men. July 1st, his invasion force landed near Alexandria and began to march over 130 miles to Cairo. But the Mamelukes who ruled over Egypt weren't about to surrender. They rallied their forces, prepared to repel the French invaders. On July 21st, with the pyramids on the horizon, Napoleon deployed his troops in square formations, all guns pointed outward. The Mamelukes flew over the dunes on horseback, but their sharp scimitars were no match for the French guns.
The French adopt the square tactics, and the attackers, of course, don't have firearms particularly. They're very good horsemen, but they can't really resist the carbines of the French army, and are mown down.
At the Battle of the Pyramids, Napoleon lost barely 30 men. Thousands of Mamelukes lay dead. Napoleon had won France a new colony, but his triumph soon became a trap. Disease, heat, and homesickness drove many of the soldiers to suicide. Attacks from insurgents wore them down. Then they encountered an even deadlier enemy, bubonic plague.
What Napoleon found in Egypt was a horror show in terms of the state of development, the weather, the degree of enmity from the locals. He hadn't been prepared for that much warfare under those terrible conditions.
Fortunately, news of trouble back home helped Napoleon escape his Egyptian quagmire. A European coalition had mobilized to invade France. August 23rd, Napoleon abandoned his army and set sail for home.
Napoleon left Egypt in 1799, and it looks very much like somebody deserting his post. It seemed for a while that the French Republic was on the brink of collapse. Napoleon was desperate to get back to France. He also felt that the moment had clearly come when he had to get back into the game of French politics.
Egypt had become a nightmare. But Napoleon used his PR genius to spin it into a triumph. His patriotic conquest, the land of the pharaohs.
When Napoleon got back to France in 1799, people didn't yet think of the Egyptian campaign as a disaster. France was still ruling Egypt, they'd conquered it. Napoleon was still widely regarded as the great hero who had conquered this colony for France.
On his return to Paris, the victor of Egypt found the government in chaos. The two legislative bodies, the Council of Elders and the Council of 500, were deadlocked. The conflict meant opportunity for a pair of ambitious conspirators, Talleyrand and the conniving politician Joseph Sieyès. Sieyès wanted to control the government. He planned to use Napoleon for political muscle, a stepping stone to power.
Napoleon knew very well that after the coup, he would be the one who would be able to call the shots. He was the one who had the loyalty of the army. He was the one who also had the great reputation among the people. Sieyès had neither of these things.
On November 10th, Napoleon made his move. He barged into the Council of Elders and delivered an incendiary speech.
You are sitting on a volcano.
The elders shouted him down, calling him a dictator. Napoleon wasn't finished. He stormed off to the Council of 500.
Napoleon marched in with 4 grenadiers. That was illegal. It was against any constitutional right that a military commander with troops would enter the houses of government. It just didn't happen, and it shouldn't happen.
Napoleon's entrance provoked a near riot. In the pandemonium, he scratched his face raw before the guards rescued him.
For once in Napoleon's life, he was quite unsure of himself. He blustered, he faltered, he essentially ran out.
Then another Bonaparte stepped in, Napoleon's brother Lucien. As Napoleon stood dazed, his brother rallied the troops. Lucien declared that British spies had infiltrated the council and attacked Napoleon. He then drew his sword, pointed it at his brother's heart.
You have a brother act, a 1-2 punch coming from Lucien and Napoleon Bonaparte. Lucien goes up to Napoleon, draws his sword, and said, if I thought this man, my own brother, were going to destroy the revolution and the Constitution, I would slay him myself.
Troops stormed into the council hall and declared a takeover. The councilmen scrambled to escape. Those who remained were forced to sign on to a new government headed by 3 consuls, but with First Consul Bonaparte running the show. Napoleon, the 30-year-old general, was officially the government of France, the embodiment of the will of the French people. "15 years later, trapped in exile, Napoleon again feels the national will calling him home. He drafts a speech to announce his glorious return to France.
Frenchmen, in my exile, your complaints and your desires have reached me. You have asked for the government of your choice. The eagle will fly from village spire to village spire, even to the towers of Notre Dame.
The imperial eagle is about to take flight. February 26, 1815. The most dangerous prisoner in Europe is about to stage a breakout. Napoleon Bonaparte is escaping from Elba. Accompanied by a contingent of imperial guards, Napoleon boards the ship the Inconstant and sails for home. A prisoner of his own ambition, Napoleon wants his empire back. An empire he imposed on the world when he crowned himself emperor 10 years before. After seizing power as first consul, Napoleon quickly stabilized the country, stamping out the spasms of violence that had rocked France since the Revolution.
What Napoleon accomplished as first consul was really very considerable. He imposed order, and he set up the basis of a durable government.
Napoleon snuffed out critics and opponents of his new regime with harsh justice. The repression sparked growing resentment, and one band of angry citizens vowed to make the new first consul feel their hatred. Christmas Eve, 1800. Napoleon headed to the opera for a performance of Haydn's Creation. Ahead, on a corner of Rue Saint-Nicaise, an ordinary wagon loaded with everyday barrels, except one packed with explosives. Napoleon, always in a rush, flew by. A split second later, the bomb went off. The explosion killed 8 people and wounded dozens. But Napoleon wasn't among the casualties.
He actually went to the opera and put in an appearance there, and when news spread that he had almost been assassinated, the spectators simply rose up and cheered him.
The attempt on his life gave First Consul Bonaparte an excuse to crack down even harder and cement his grip on power.
Thereafter, people ask the question, what happens if Napoleon dies? And so Napoleon encourages the debate as to what happens to the state if he's not there.
Napoleon called for a national referendum. By a vote of over 3 million to 8,000, he was elected first consul for life. But even lifetime dictatorship couldn't satisfy his ambitions.
Well, Napoleon is eventually convinced that in order to establish a really durable regime, and in order to be accepted by the rest of Europe, he has to be a monarch.
Napoleon proclaimed the birth of a new empire, a power base beyond any king or queen. A realm with a new Caesar at its head, Emperor Bonaparte.
To declare yourself emperor was in no way the same thing as making yourself king. In making himself emperor, Napoleon and his contemporaries did not see himself as becoming a monarch in the old regime sense of the term. He was occupying a Roman position that had all the glory that attached to Roman history.
On December 2nd, 1804, Napoleon's family, his court, and the Pope himself gathered in the darkness of Notre Dame Cathedral. Napoleon Bonaparte, 35-year-old Corsican upstart raised a crown of golden laurels and placed it on his own head.
He staged this incredible, grandiose coronation ceremony for himself, but also to get the Pope there, to get the Pope in his presence so that Napoleon would be accepted as legitimate by Catholics both inside of France and outside.
I wanted to rule the world, and in order to do this I needed unlimited power. The world begged me to govern it. Sovereigns and nations vied with one another in throwing themselves under my scepter.
In a single moment, Napoleon served the world notice. His ambition knew no limits. His empire would have no boundaries.
The benefits of the coronation, in terms of the effect it had on Europe, the other monarchs, the fact that the Pope came to Paris and performed this ceremony was spellbinding.
To prove himself worthy, the self-proclaimed emperor needed a battle that would make history. 1 year later, he got the perfect opportunity. October 1805, Napoleon's old enemy Austria was on the offensive. The Austrians wanted to keep the upstart empire out of northern Italy. They forged an alliance with Britain, the giant of the East, Russia. Napoleon struck back with his Grande Armée. He crushed the Austrians with ease. Then Napoleon tackled the giant. He found the Russian army camped with Austrian forces near the town of Austerlitz.
Napoleon spends about a week before the battle going around the area, reconnoitering it, making sure he knows what's going on. He has about 100,000 troops gathered around this battlefield of Austerlitz.
Napoleon opened with a bluff. Pretending to retreat, he lured the enemy into treacherous ground. A battlefield surrounded by hidden French troops. Leading the Russians into battle was Tsar Alexander. But Alexander was a novice on the battlefield, and no match for the military mastermind of the era.
The men around the Tsar Alexander, including the Tsar Alexander, were young hotheads. And they were convinced that the French were vulnerable, and so they attacked.
Alexander marched his army straight into Napoleon's trap. French troops slaughtered thousands of Russians. Tsar Alexander barely escaped with his life. At Austerlitz, French forces wiped out a third of the Russian army. And one man emerged as the military master of Europe, the Emperor Napoleon.
Austerlitz shows Napoleon at his strategic best as an intuitive general, sensing what the terrain calls for and how the psychology of the enemy can be best exploited to use that to fight them against themselves.
Napoleon's triumph demonstrated his perfection of the art of war. And the Bonaparte hype machine made the most of it.
The other greatness of Napoleon is, after the battle, writing it out, telling the story of the battle in such a way as to make it look as though he had been a grand strategist who planned this very battle 6 months before. What in effect was a game of poker, he made out to be a round of chess.
9 years later, Napoleon prepares to recapture the glory of Austerlitz. The coast of France looms on the horizon, but the former emperor doesn't know whether he'll be cheered on arrival or shot. After 10 months in exile, Napoleon once again plants his feet on French soil. Vindication or defeat, his fate lies ahead on the road to Paris. February 1815. Only 10 months after being banished, the emperor is coming home. prisoner of Elba, has broken out of exile. Napoleon's invasion of France has begun.
Napoleon doesn't know what his reception is going to be in France. He obviously has his supporters, but he doesn't know how much those who've gone over to the royal party will follow him. So it is a gamble.
Napoleon lands at Gulf Juan with secrecy on his side. But the emperor wants his comeback seen as a legitimate return to power, not a military coup.
Well, one thing that Napoleon had to promise the French at this point was that he would not plunge them back into the kind of disastrous wars, and that he would not reestablish the kind of repressive regime that he had presided over during the Empire. So Napoleon promised that he would try to take back France without firing a shot.
Napoleon's audacious march on Paris begins in the foothills of the Alps. Napoleon and his men move like the wind, 30 miles in 24 hours. They pass through Castellane, Digne. Still, no one rises up to stop him.
This man has bled the French Empire dry. He has left the bones of men and boys to bleach on the sands of Egypt, on the steppes of Russia, in central Germany, in northern Italy, in Spain. He has brought his empire down with a resounding crash around him. How is it the French don't shoot him on sight?
I suppose it's possible that had he landed in the wrong area, had he come across a military detachment that was loyal to the new government, he might very well have been shot. But he was lucky. So many times throughout his career, he met with a population that hailed his return. And then very quickly, the army did start going over to him. This was obviously the crucial thing.
500 miles away in Vienna, the Allies plot the future of France. Then they hear the stunning news. Bonaparte has escaped.
When the Allies meeting in Vienna hear that Napoleon has left Elba and is going back through France and is attracting support, they describe him as a general outlaw. And so he is someone who has to be stopped.
No one in Vienna feels the heat more than Charles Talleyrand. He has sold out Napoleon to win clout in the new French regime. Then comes word that his old partner is back in business. Talleyrand's schemes are about to be smashed to bits.
Talleyrand began making sure that he could control the internal affairs of France during whatever period Napoleon would be there.
The great leaders of Europe mobilize to retaliate. One advantage for the Allies is a hostage they hold in Vienna. One thing Napoleon wants most, his 3-year-old son. At the height of his imperial power, Napoleon Bonaparte had it all. An empire, an adoring populace, and an empress at his side. But to build a dynasty, one thing was still missing. A son.
Besides wanting to be emperor, to solidify that position among the rulers of Europe, he also needed an heir to solidify the dynasty. Josephine was barren. And so he needed to look for someone who could bear him that child.
Although he still clearly had great feelings for Josephine, that desire for an heir came before everything else.
Napoleon reluctantly told Josephine he needed to divorce her.
The divorce was in reason of state, and I think Napoleon did it with a good deal of personal sadness, but without hesitation.
For Napoleon, the quest for an heir was a matter of state, not the heart. When he was shown a portrait of the Austrian emperor's daughter, Marie-Louise, he declared, That's just the kind of womb I want to marry.
For Napoleon, marrying her would serve two obvious purposes. First, she was young and she was probably fertile. And secondly, this would, he thought, finally truly legitimize him in the eyes of the crowned heads of Europe.
For an interloper to marry into perhaps the oldest reigning family in Europe was no small accomplishment.
In April, Napoleon made Marie-Louise his empress. Within a year, she delivered. 100 rounds of cannon fire rang out across Paris, announcing the birth of Napoleon Francois, heir to the Bonaparte dynasty.
The birth of Napoleon's son was one of the great events in his life. He felt finally that the continuity of the empire had been assured and that his name would live forever as the founder of a new dynasty of French monarchs.
During Napoleon's exile, Marie-Louise fled to Vienna with their child. The father of the would-be dynasty was denied any contact with his son. 1 year later, Napoleon is back to reclaim his throne and an empire for his heir. But first he must once again win the hearts of the French people. On the long road to Paris, the emperor's charm begins to work its magic.
The march to Paris is one continuous set of good news, and at almost no point along the way does anything go against him.
He's either able to avoid hostile areas, or he simply is able to win the soldiers over to him, and more, this becomes legendary as it's happening.
In the town of Gap, a few old officers join the crusade. The next morning, cheering crowds trail the troops for 6 miles. Napoleon's comeback is gathering strength. In Paris, a letter arrives for Louis XVIII. The message: Napoleon is on his way to Paris. The king cries out, "It is revolution once more."
His house folded like a house of cards. Just one after another, everything fell apart. Louis still really didn't even know what to do.
In desperation, King Louis officially declares Napoleon a traitor. It's now every loyal French soldier's duty to kill Bonaparte on sight. March 7th. As Napoleon arrives in the fray, his troops find themselves staring down the muskets of the king's men. Napoleon orders his soldiers to lower their guns. Determined not to fire a shot, the emperor slowly walks forward.
Soldiers of the Fifth, I am your emperor. Know me. If there is one among you who would kill his emperor, his general, here I stand.
King's men drop their guns, shouting, "Long live the Emperor," and rush to embrace Napoleon.
His power of character somehow makes the troops that were opposing him join him and continue this extraordinary flight of the eagle, as it's called, when he comes up from the south of France to Paris.
It's hard to say whether Napoleon still had a real spell over France at this time, but he had a spell over the army. He was the person who had brought them, yes, to terrible defeat, but he'd also brought them to glory. He had inspired incredible loyalty in the French army, and this great gesture of coming back to France, of defying the Allies, of landing, simply inspired people in a way that hardly anything has ever inspired people in history. And they followed him.
It was really a good indication to Napoleon that his personal charisma was still there. And from then on out, he was building an army, and that whole spirit, yes, we can have it back. Yes, we can be great again. Here he is to lead us on. It was there.
Pride of France, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte is back. Napoleon Bonaparte was broken out of exile and won back the countryside. After 3 weeks marching north through France, the deposed emperor is just hours from Paris. But not everyone is thrilled by Napoleon's miraculous resurrection. Members of the king's court flee the capital in fear. The hysteria reaches the palace. The king's attendants urge him to run for his life. After all, his own brother, Louis XVI, lost his head to the revolution. The king cuts his reign short and makes a quick exit.
Napoleon's return to France was not a great moment for Louis XVIII. He promised very grandiloquently to die before being forced to flee France again. And then, with Napoleon approaching Paris, he fled France again.
On March 20th, cheering crowds carry the emperor into the Tuileries Palace. His comeback is a triumph. In just 20 days, he has reclaimed his crown and country, true to his word, without firing a single shot. But the final piece of the imperial puzzle is missing: his son and heir. The Austrian emperor forbids any reunion between Napoleon and his son.
For the Allies, not letting Marie-Louise and Napoleon's son go back was a clear sign that they considered his return utterly illegitimate. It would have caused great problems for the Allies had the Austrian emperor's daughter been there back in France as empress. It would have seemed to give legitimacy back to Napoleon and his empire. They weren't going to let this happen.
The emperor isn't the only one missing a son. After nearly 20 years of Napoleon's bloody wars, hardly a family in France hasn't sacrificed a son to conscription, the draft.
Conscription was probably the one single thing that people hated the most about his regime. It took young men away from their families and sent them off for years where they'd have hardly any contact with their family. Back then, if you went into the army, there was a very great chance that you'd die of disease before you even met the enemy.
To feed Napoleon's war machine, France has already sacrificed more than 900,000 sons. The nation refuses to do it again. Government ministers surprise the emperor with the Additional Act, a law that reins in Napoleon's powers and restricts conscription.
That Additional Act meant that Napoleon wasn't going to be restored to the empire that he thought, not to the kind of constitution he had. He had a problem.
Without the draft, Napoleon is powerless against his enemies. Meanwhile, the Allies gather in Vienna and plot to eliminate him permanently. And no one in Vienna shares more history or hatred of Napoleon than Alexander Romanov, the Tsar of Russia. 1807. After humiliating Alexander at Austerlitz, Napoleon poured salt in the wound. In a string of ferocious battles, he drove the Russians back to their borders. The carnage brought the Russian Tsar to the bargaining table. In a tent on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, Tsar Alexander I and Napoleon Bonaparte met face to face for the first time.
Je suis enchanté d'entendre mon père.
And something unexpected happened. Napoleon was charmed.
His first remarks to Napoleon when they meet in this raft is, "I hate the English as much as you do." And then Napoleon replies, "Well, if that's the case, I think we can do business."
Napoleon was ready to embrace Alexander. He was ready to almost fall in love with him. And he did. He wrote back to Josephine saying, "If Alexander was a woman, I'd marry him."
Alexander is very romantic about his vision of Napoleon, and he, as it were, falls in love with Napoleon. He falls under the spell of Napoleon.
What's clear is that the two of them seduced each other. For once, somebody did a number on Napoleon.
The leaders signed the Treaty of Tilsit, effectively blockading trade between Europe and France's arch-enemy, Britain.
They talked about how they would divide Europe. where they would draw the boundary line. This belonged to Napoleon, this belonged to Alexander. Where Alexander could expand south of Russia, Napoleon could continue the control of Western Europe.
The two rulers parted, with Napoleon believing he had dealt the British a death blow. But before the afterglow of their summit had time to dim, Napoleon discovered that Russia was secretly trading with Britain. Alexander had betrayed him.
The Russian economy was in desperate straits, and Alexander needed to trade with Britain and needed to trade outside of Europe. And so he gave in eventually, and Napoleon was crushed.
Napoleon was furious at Alexander's infidelity. It was proof that he could trust no one. If he was to rule Europe, he would have to do it alone. Spring 1815. Russia and the rest of Europe are again uniting against him. The resurrected emperor must fight. But after his breathtaking march back to power, Napoleon believes nothing is impossible. Russia, Prussia, England, Austria, let them all conspire to crush him. He can build a new war machine to recapture his glory, whether his people like it or not. The emperor is back and ready to take on the world. Napoleon Bonaparte has reclaimed his imperial crown. He's defied the other nations of Europe and begun a 100-day quest to rebuild his empire. The French people have again given him their hearts, but not the dictatorial powers he once enjoyed. New legislation strips the emperor's right to draft an army. But laws have never stopped Napoleon before. He knows the Allies are pooling their forces to take him out for good. And even Napoleon can't win a war without soldiers.
I've often thought of the 100 Days as a kind of a suicide pact between Napoleon and his people. There was a hopeless love that united the French. The French understood that war was inevitable.
Napoleon launches what France had feared, a massive forced rearmament. He converts warehouses to musket factories, ordering 240,000 guns. The firestorm left little food, few supplies, and winter was approaching fast.
He thinks that once I've got the capital city, I should have the control of Russia. But he doesn't. And he doesn't understand why that's the case. Russia is in fact this giant sort of, it's not a centralized situation, it's lots of little centers. So taking the capital city makes no difference whatsoever.
Napoleon set up camp in the Kremlin. For weeks, he ignored the warnings of his officers that the time had come to head back to France.
It's always been a bit of a mystery to me why Napoleon hung on for as long as he did in Moscow. He certainly underestimated the difficulty of marching out in the winter.
5 weeks passed. Finally, Napoleon ordered the retreat. 1,500 miles back to Paris.
They started to march out of Moscow, and very quickly they ran into the Russian winter. They had never seen anything like this before.
Coming out of Moscow, I think one of the most horrifying scenes is what was left of the Battle of Borodino, which had led the way into Moscow. It had never been cleared. There were half-eaten skeletons lying on this sloping hill.
Fierce blizzards splintered Napoleon's army. Packs of Cossacks flew in through the snows on horseback and picked off the French one by one. Thousands starved or froze to death. Some even turned to cannibalism to survive.
Winter came in worse and worse, And this is 500 miles into Russia at 20 miles a day. It's long, it's painful, it's cold, it's dark.
The army suffered unimaginably. There are stories of people simply falling in the snow and being covered by the snow. There are stories of horses that were so cold that the desperate soldiers would be slicing chunks of flesh off the horses and just eating them raw, and that the horses wouldn't even notice because they were completely numb from the cold. It was one of the great disasters in history.
He had marched into Russia with over 500,000 men. Barely 25,000 staggered out. Back in Paris, Napoleon confronted a nation disillusioned by his disastrous Russian campaign. Prussia and Austria were planning an invasion of France. The Allies massed their troops across the border in Belgium. On June 15th, Napoleon marches his men right at them. The Emperor declares the time has come to conquer or die. He commands a force of over 120,000 men. But he's about to tackle two armies, the Allies under Wellington and the Prussians, with twice as many soldiers. In the face of such odds, Napoleon's first challenge is to keep his troops motivated.
The spell that Napoleon had over the army, particularly over the Guard, continued in 100 days. He was able to raise an army not as large as he wanted, but impressively large nonetheless, and marched it to Belgium, where he hoped that he could confront the Allies and beat them decisively. And this is what he promised the soldiers, that they would go, they would have a short campaign and win, and France would be restored to its glory.
As his first move, Napoleon takes the Belgian town of Charleroi, step one of his strategy to drive a wedge between Wellington's troops and the Prussians, dividing their strength. To tackle the two armies, Napoleon appoints two seasoned commanders, Michel Ney and Emmanuel Grouchy. Grouchy will help Napoleon take on the Prussians, while Marshal Ney will lead the cavalry against Wellington's forces. On the eve of the battle, Wellington attends a lavish ball for the Allies in Brussels. With Napoleon's forces nearly 2 days away, Wellington is the picture of calm. But after midnight, the message arrives from the front. Napoleon's troops are less than 24 hours from Brussels.
Wellington at Lady Richmond's ball was surprised not by the fact that Napoleon was going to attack them in Belgium, they expected that, but again, the speed at which he arrived on their front door.
The Allied commander keeps his cool, then politely takes his leave. Wellington's plan had been to head off the French at the nearby town of Quatre Bras. Once again, Napoleon has beaten the Allies to the punch.
Wellington supposedly remarks, "He's humbugged me, by God," and immediately leaves the ball and starts organizing his army to go fight.
Wellington surveys the map for a better spot for the battle.
We must fight him here.
Time, terrain, and tactics all point to the fields south of Brussels and a village called Waterloo. June 16, 1815. The fate of Europe, France, and the modern world's greatest warrior meet at a crossroads in Belgium, Waterloo. For Napoleon Bonaparte to survive, he must win the battle of his life. 120,000 troops against an enemy nearly twice the size. The combined armies of Prussia and Britain. Napoleon has beaten the odds before, but now he seems a haunted man. He hesitates, slow to issue commands. But the war won't wait. Napoleon's right-hand man, Marshal Ney, opens the assault. 4,000 French cavalrymen draw their sabers and charge. But Ney orders the attack too late, giving Wellington's infantry time to form an unbeatable defense, impenetrable square formations.
The way you beat the cavalry is you formed your soldiers into a square, bristling with muskets firing out phalanx of a sort. And it was very difficult for cavalry to come up against a square like that. The horses would not charge into a square. They would draw up and then they'd be vulnerable.
Wellington waits until the French are within 30 yards, gives the command. Ney's horsemen fall like broken toys.
The charge by Ney is not supported by the infantry or artillery fire. So they just smash up against the squares, these squares, the famous squares of Waterloo. Ney's cavalry takes such a battering that they have to retreat.
Ney's attack is a disaster, but the bad news fails to reach Napoleon. At Ligny, he orders his Imperial Guards to attack the Prussians on his right. His finest troops launch into the enemy, obliterating whole regiments. As the Prussians fall back, Napoleon sends Marshal Grouchy to finish them off. Napoleon has no idea of Ney's crushing defeat, and he's convinced both Wellington and the Prussians are on the run. Victory appears almost in reach. June 18th, morning on the battlefield. Napoleon is exhausted. He spent the night having his hemorrhoids treated with leeches.
The constant years of war had taken a real toll on Napoleon. By the end of his empire, he had gotten fat. He suffered terribly from this condition called dysuria that made it incredibly painful to urinate. He suffered from terrible hemorrhoids. He suffered from insomnia. All of these things were plaguing him to one extent or another during the final campaign.
Fighting pain and doubt, he tries to fire up his exhausted generals.
I tell you now that Wellington is a bad general, that the English are bad soldiers, and that the whole thing will be a picnic.
His officers aren't so optimistic. One says the British troops are impregnable, famous for their tenacity and marksmanship. Another warns Napoleon, English infantry in close combat is the very devil. But Napoleon won't stand for pessimism.
Gentlemen, if my orders are carried out well, tonight we shall sleep in Brussels.
1 p.m. In the distance, Napoleon sees a mass of troops approaching. Finally, Marshal Grouchy has returned with reinforcements. Victory is at hand.
It was the key moment of the battle when Napoleon saw a mass of troops approaching the battlefield, and his heart leapt because he thought this was Grouchy coming back and bringing him the troops he needed.
But closer inspection confirms his worst fears. They're not French soldiers, they're Prussians.
There were 35,000 Prussians on Napoleon's right wing, so he was already being enveloped on the right wing as early as 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So clearly a very critical situation.
At 4 o'clock, the Prussians tear into Napoleon's right flank. By 7, Prussian and British troops are closing in on both sides. Napoleon's last hope lies in his loyal Imperial Guard.
The Imperial Guard are the elite corps. They are the creme de la creme. They started off as Napoleon's bodyguard, gradually grew and grew and grew until it became a corps in its own right. This is his personal, private army.
Napoleon rallies his most loyal troops with a lie. He tells them Grouchy has returned with 30,000 more troops. The numbers are on their side. Their spirits lifted, the Emperor's faithful Imperial Guard charged forward. Napoleon's last-ditch effort to save his empire hangs on the strength of his finest troops. They've saved the day before. If they fail now, the emperor and his empire will be crushed forever. Waterloo, June 18, 1815. Time and again, Napoleon Bonaparte has outfoxed the armies of Europe. Today, his men are outmanned and outgunned. British and Prussian regiments surround the French. But Napoleon has fired up his Imperial Guard with a lie that more troops are on the way. Flush with confidence, the Guard march forward. At their Emperor's command, they advance uphill in a slow formation, smack into the sights of the British guns.
It's hard to say whether Napoleon was at the top of his game at Waterloo. Probably not. There are endless debates among military specialists about whether he was still the genius he was. Certainly he didn't perform as well as he had at the Battle of Austerlitz.
The Imperial Guard marches headlong at Wellington's front line. Wellington waits until the French are within 50 paces, then gives the command. Less than 60 seconds, hundreds of French soldiers are mowed down. British cavalry fly over the hill and strike the final death blow. Napoleon tries to rush into the fray. His men hold him back, saying the enemy has been fortunate enough.
The last gasp of the Imperial Guard happens when Napoleon throws them against the British. They do something which, for almost all the French army, was absolutely unheard of, which is they turn back. There was the famous statement that the Guard never retreats, it dies. But on this occasion, they retreated. French forces break into full frenzied retreat. A few guardsmen hold out long enough to cover the retreat of the Emperor himself. Napoleon's comeback is over.
Waterloo, he was outnumbered. There were, in theory, 200,000 Allied troops nearby, and he only had about 80,000. I think the French probably performed as well as they could have done on that day.
June 19, 1815. Napoleon's last campaign to terrorize Europe has terrorized no one more than his own people. In just 2 days, 25,000 French soldiers are slaughtered. Even as he slinks home in disgrace, Napoleon refuses to accept defeat.
Napoleon didn't give up. He wrote his brother and said, "Joseph, we can get more horses to pull cannon. I can get some more men together. This is just a skirmish." Carnage all over the battlefield. Incredible death.
Napoleon fantasizes new campaigns. But now hardly anyone in France will support his madness. June 22nd, the Prussians are closing in on Paris. At his palace, Napoleon receives the Allies' formal demand for his abdication. He erupts in a tirade and raves about reviving the terrors of the revolution to save his reign. But his delusion finally comes to an end.
It is too great a price to pay for one man's life. I did not return from Elba to drench Paris in blood.
After barely 100 days in power, and only 4 days after his defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon gives up his empire for the second time. As the Allied armies flood into France, Napoleon flees to Malmaison, the retreat he once shared with Josephine. 29th, a message arrives that the Prussians are poised to storm Paris. Napoleon must flee or face capture. Instead, he explodes in a final outburst.
France ought not submit to a handful of Prussians.
He rushes up to his bedroom and emerges dressed in the uniform of the Imperial Guard. All is not lost. He pledges a new crusade to crush the enemies at the gates of Paris.
After the Battle of Waterloo, with hindsight, it looks pretty clear that this was the end of the road for Napoleon Bonaparte. He really had no cards to play with at this point. And so finally, he dressed this up as doing it for France, that he was doing it for the good of his people who wouldn't be subjected to more war. But really, he didn't have much choice. He had to give up.
The Allied armies march into Paris, and Louis XVIII returns to the throne. Barely 1 year earlier, a British frigate transported Napoleon to Elba. Now another British warship carries him away from France and out of Europe forever. The fury of Napoleon's 100 days taught the Allies a bitter lesson about exile. This time, they take no chances. The man who had dominated an entire continent will live out his final days on a speck of rock 1,200 miles from the African coast, the remote island of St. Helena. 17 years of warfare, 6 million people dead. Views on Napoleon's legacy are as sharply divided as the Europe he left behind.
When one looks at the legacy of Napoleon, one can take the military side, which says France ended up with less than what she had begun with. But during the wars, there was glory.
There was a period when Napoleon could have negotiated with Britain, and they probably would have let him keep what he got. But like the gambler who has to keep going, he couldn't stop. What he wanted was not just a peace, but a glorious peace.
From Corsica to the crown, from exile in Elba to the apocalypse at Waterloo, his greatest gamble was his ill-fated imperial comeback. In just 4 months, he escaped from Elba, marshaled an army, and challenged all of Europe. His 100 days of power culminated in an epic final battle. One man's will versus an entire continent.
The 100 Days, the return from Elba, in the annals of adventure, remains one of the most unusual episodes in human history.
Napoleon himself, when he was in exile in St. Helena, famously remarked, "What a novel my life has been." People could hardly believe that a single man had done this. It really seemed like something out of the most fantastic sort of fiction.
May 5th, 1821. At 51 years of age, Napoleon Bonaparte dies. The Corsican upstart who shook the world enters the realm of history.
Napoleon's life seems to be what you can do if you try hard enough. So that's the enduring fascination for people, is that somehow he's an image of success. And also there's tragic destiny.
A life written in blood. Conqueror, emperor, prisoner, Napoleon Bonaparte.
America was founded on potential, on the idea that it's better to see things not as they are, but for what they could be.
የዕለቱ አስተናጋጃችሁ አብራር ነበርኩ። መልካም ቆይታ። በዚህ ነፃነት አዲሱ ዘፈን ዝግጅታችን ያበቃል። በተመሳሳይ ዝግጅት እስክንገናኝ ድረስ bon voyage.
Again, come let us have. You can start a dinner cut to right now. I want you, I don't know your left. The paper so like a suit can my friend. Can I not again, come let us have. You can start a dinner cut to right now.